Hi, I'm Tom Hendrickson from the DevOps Online Summit, and welcome to our sponsor interview with Kurt Andersen. This session is brought to you by Blameless, the industry's first end-to-end SRE platform. Go to bit.ly/DOS-Blameless to learn more. Back to you, Kurt. Kurt, why don't you introduce yourself to the people here at the DevOps Online Summit?
Hi there, I'm Kurt Andersen, and I am an SRE, have been an SRE at LinkedIn until I came to Blameless about a month and a half ago now to get a little bit of taste of what the startup life is like. But even before having the official title, I was kind of doing SRE type things at other companies.
So you've been in this space for a while.
I have. I can probably date it back to roughly around the time the term was coined at Google. Although I wasn't aware of the term until LinkedIn reached out to me and said, "Hey, we've seen your profile, and would you like to work for us?"
Yes, new and interesting challenges, right, Kurt?
Indeed. It's site reliability is an interesting field. It's kind of an adaptation of what the old sysadmin space, but with an expanded scope. And it overlaps a bunch with some of the DevOps principles. And it's actually quite compatible for people who are interested in DevOps to be doing SRE type work as well.
So your title today, Kurt, is Site Reliability Principles for Everyone. So give us kind of a nutshell of what you mean by that.
Well, I think that the organizing principles, the foundations of SRE, can actually be used beneficially by a lot of people, even outside folks who have the title or think of themselves as SREs. It's kind of, in some ways, like I'd liken it to a car. There's certain levels of maintenance that you can do for your car, and more or less everybody should be able to like change a tire or maybe fill up the oil. Let's say put fluid in the washer, the windshield washers. And those are sort of fundamental principles I would liken to SRE principles. You don't have to be the expert. You don't have to be the one who can take the engine apart and put it back together without any spare parts.
I'm kind of laughing, Kurt, because you're talking about changing a tire, and I recently had to do that. And I was talking to my 19-year-old daughter, and she just kind of looked at me funny, and she said, "In theory, I can do it. I learned it in driver's ed." And I said, "In theory, that's an interesting way to look at it." So.
Yeah, and I think it applies in a bunch of other areas as well. That there's things that people have learned from the book, so to speak.
Yeah.
And maybe have done it once hands-on because they had to demonstrate it on a test. But at the same time, these are things that I think are beneficial for people to use as kind of patterns of thinking. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. So what are the principles of SRE?
Well, I've boiled them down at my current moment of thinking to 5 principles. The first one is measure what matters. The second one is to develop an eye or an ear for problems. The third one is to solve problems swiftly and collaboratively. And then fourth is to feed back the learnings from those incidents so that you make the system better. And then ultimately you want to work on moving from a reactive stance to a proactive stance. So those are kind of the 5 principles that I find for SRE.
So I'm going through those. I'm taking copious notes here, Kurt, but measure what matters. That seems pretty broad. And in the SRE and DevOps space, there's probably a lot of things we could measure, isn't there?
There are. And I think, I mean, from a DevOps point of view, I think I'd push people back to Accelerate as one of the canonical books in the field. And they came up with 4 measures that help to characterize the effectiveness of a delivery pipeline. And I've seen them cited elsewhere without attribution. But I think that Nicole and Jez were the first ones to come up with those. Um, that works well for if you're trying to measure the effectiveness of your delivery practices. And some of them actually overlap into the operations space. When you talk about things like how long does it take you to recover from a problem, and what percentage of your deliveries into production have some sort of a problem. Um, for an SRE who's more focused on whether or not the value that's being delivered to the customer is the right thing, if it's meeting its needs. Again, we're looking at measurements that track or proxy that customer happiness. You don't care if your disk is getting full. I mean, ultimately, if it's going to take your service down, then that's a bad thing. But seriously, if your CPU, let's go to CPU instead. If your CPU is running at 96%, so what? If the service is responsive and delivering what it needs to deliver, who cares if your CPU is at 96%? It's there, make it work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
so
important.
And that's an aspect of measuring what matters. But the other thing is, I have a model of, if you're looking to see if a service is, quote, up, what does up mean to you? Mm-hmm. Does it mean that you can ping the server? Does it mean that you can get a 200 response back from the service? Does it mean that the service is actually giving you something useful with that 200 response? So that's where, as you up level into the space of, does it matter to the customer, that I think it's important and becomes more useful.
What about kind of developing an eye for problems? What are some techniques? And I'm sure you've probably picked up a few things that you use.
Yeah, this is an area where a lot of teams struggle. There's a lovely French term that I ran across called déformation professionnelle, which I probably have butchered the accent, but or the pronunciation. But it talks about this way that we get squashed into the mold of whatever is sort of expected. Mm-hmm. Think about a service that, think about a flaky test, for example. A test that is a unit test for your software, but it only succeeds 70% of the time. Do you put up with that and just rerun it until it finally passes and then you ship the software? Or do you dig into, do you spot that as a problem and go in and try to address the problem that leads to the inconsistency of the test results?
Mm-hmm. I'm only laughing, Kurt, because I've been there.
I think we all have.
Yeah. 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 It reminds me of
so
Gary.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it reminds me of Gary Groover. I think he had talked a little bit about this, about, basically a unit test that doesn't function repeatedly the same way isn't really useful at all. So it's kind of leads to what you're saying.
Right. And it's other things. It's like software that doesn't work well. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. You figure out a way to work around that problem. But a lot of people will work around it without recognizing that they are working around a problem, and the problem ought to actually be fixed.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I know I've been like the new person at various places and asked those kind of, you might think they're stupid questions at the start, but sometimes it takes someone who's maybe new to a situation to say, wait a minute, is it supposed to work that way? And then
exactly.
So yeah, it kind of leads to
it's the being willing to ask the dumb questions. I had a boss once who said, I need to pass the red face test, so I'm going to ask you these silly questions because I need to be able to answer them when someone asks me.
Yes, good point. Good point. So, Kurt, to be an SRE, do we need to have special skills?
I don't think that they are special in the sense that maybe you would consider, like, say, the SEALs have special operations. But there are some skills that really help SREs. SREs are called to work across a large breadth of the system. So you need to have reasonably good communication skills. Ideally, that's both spoken and written. And written communication skills is often a gap for engineers. You need to be able to have empathy. to understand what the other side is saying and where they're coming from. And you need the ability to sort of zoom in to nitty gritty details, as well as zoom out and take a larger systems perspective. So if your service, for example, is running slowly, you need to potentially be able to dive all the way in and find that there's something in the TLS handshake that's not working, that's leading to that overall system effect. And so that in and out zoom capability is really beneficial.
Yeah, I can see that being hard sometimes for engineers. I know I can get focused on like the minute details, but sometimes we kind of have to pull back and say, okay, what's the real problem here? What's the big picture?
Exactly. And that being able to take that systems wide view is one of the things that is characterizes SREs in general and the way that they operate.
And I like that you brought up empathy. It's funny. I know I was doing an interview with another DevOps Online Summit presenter, Nirmal Mehta, and he talked about the same thing about empathy and how important it is, because I think technically sometimes we come into a situation and don't think about, okay, how are they looking at it? Because it might be somebody from a different part of the technology team, or maybe somebody from the business. And we need to kind of like you were talking about, those perspectives, zooming in and zooming out, using the right terminology. So we're not, like if somebody who's not technically savvy, we don't throw a bunch of jargon at them that they're like,
yes,
Kurt, what are you talking about?
Right. Being able to translate your language into something that's meaningful for the other side is really a helpful skill.
Mm-hmm. So how do we instill these principles into SRE professionals?
Oh, well, honestly, kind of apprenticeship seems to be the most effective way these days. Being willing to mentor people who are learning, recognizing some degree of self-insight and realizing when we don't have those skills and seeking out ways to improve. I think it all comes to an attitude and a perspective of continuous learning, continuous improvement. And a Twitter thread I saw yesterday uses the phrase continuous and never-ending improvement.
Yes.
So they get a cute little acronym out of that one.
Yes, of course. So Kurt, are there organizations that should not be pursuing SRE?
I would say yes. Yes and no. Yes, in that it will not be a fit for them. I think there's some foundational culture elements that are important for SRE to be to take hold and to operate effectively. There needs to be a culture of psychological safety. Again, in Accelerate, they talk about that along the Westrom culture model. There needs to be a focus on making sure that the teams have engineering time where they can spend on work to make tomorrow better than today, and to eradicate toil, or not completely eliminate it, but to drive it down. And toil, in this case, I'm using to describe manual, low value work that scales with load, whatever the load is, more customers, more queries, more servers. Any of that, if it scales with the load, then you're going to end up having to feed the machine with people. And that's not a very humane way to operate. And ultimately, I say if a company or at least a portion of an organization doesn't have a commitment to reliability as feature number one, or at least a desire to get to that point, then SRE is not going to be a good fit.
Kurt, you've shared a lot with us. Any closing thoughts?
It's interesting to me that so many companies, as we have looked at some of the Gartner and other analysts' research, want to do SRE and recognize that it's hard to do, partly because you can't readily hire people, and you can't buy it off the shelf. I hope that these principles will give every engineer that listens an idea of some things that they can do at least to up level their own team, and move in a more democratized fashion toward good operational and reliability execution.
Thanks for coming on, Kurt.
Thank you, Tom.
This session is brought to you by Blameless, the industry's first end-to-end SRE platform. Go to bit.ly/DOS-Blameless to learn more. On behalf of Kurt Andersen, I am Tom Hendrickson for the DevOps Online Summit.